Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on succession planning, the good, the bad, and the ugly. This morning, we have two fantastic panelists with us, bringing deep expertise in leadership development, M&A, and business strategy. I'd like to turn over this presentation to Galilea Estrada, who will go through some housekeeping rules before we get started with our panelists.
Thank you, Dora. Good morning, everyone. My name is Galilea, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. Thank you for taking the time after a holiday weekend to join us. We're excited to have you all here. I would like to take a moment and thank our presenters, Jenny Tran and Daniel Feiman, as well as our moderator, Dora Lanza, for sharing their knowledge with us today. Before we dive into our presentation, I do have a few housekeeping items I would like to cover. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. We will be sharing the recording after the session with you guys to revisit the content at your convenience. If you all have any troubles accessing the content, you guys can reach out to myself or Dora, and we can go ahead and work with you guys on that. Any information presented today is for educational purposes only. It should not be considered as legal or financial advice. Any specific questions or concerns that any of you may have, please consult with a qualified professional in their respective field to get a little more information on that. We do encourage you to share your questions throughout the presentation. We'll do our best to address them as they come up. However, if we can't get to your question right away, don't worry. We have allotted 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to answer any remaining questions, and any questions that we weren't able to cover in the webinar, we will be sending an email following up to answer those for you guys. The contact information for panelists will also be included, so if you have any questions that come up after the webinar, you can go ahead and reach out to Jenny, Daniel, or Dora, and they can go ahead and answer those for you. On that note, I'll hand it back to Dora and we'll get started.
Thank you, Galilea. I'd like to have Jenny introduce herself. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your practice, Jenny.
Yes, thank you, Dora. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jenny Tran. I'm a business lawyer here at Stradling Law, and my practice and passion is business succession planning, serving as outside general counsel, and representing business owners on their transition or transaction. A bit of background about myself and why this topic is my passion. I came from very humble beginnings where my parents started their international distribution business at a swap meet, and playing under a blue tarp at a table was one of my earliest memories. As they scaled and leveled up and grew their enterprise, I had the benefit and privilege of working alongside them. And so when I was picking my area of practice, I decided that it would be my privilege to represent business owners. So I'm here today with these esteemed presenters to talk to you about business succession planning, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Thank you, Jenny. And Daniel, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you, Dora. And I'm very pleased to be here with the two of you, as well as Galilea, managing everything. I left commercial banking 29 years ago, believe it or not, to start this firm because I didn't feel I could make enough of a difference with my clients. So when we started it, Build It Backwards, literally 29 years ago, the idea was to work with small to medium enterprises and give them the tools, the techniques, the secrets behind the cloak, if you will, of how to run a better business for the longest time. And we really just focus on strategy, leadership, finance, and succession. So there's a connection here. And we do have a couple of entrepreneurs in my background, particularly my grandfather, my uncle, who started their own businesses and ran them their entire sessions. So I'm thrilled to be here. And yes, we will definitely touch on, with some examples, the good, the bad, and the ugly of succession planning.
Thank you, Daniel. Well, all of you know I'm Dora Lanza. I'm your moderator. Let's see. And my husband and I founded this business 26 years ago. a little bit over 26 years ago. And it came about after we had built a mortgage banking organization that we grew from just two of us that started it to a multi-state and 189 employees. And when it came time to do succession, there was no one out there that we could reach out to. So what you're about to hear from Daniel and Jenny are some of the examples of what happens when you don't have the right team with you to help you assess and plan. We left a lot of money on the table. Instead of doing a flat out merger, which we could have had we been well advised. We ended up doing just a very quick sale and left a lot of money on the table, but learned a lot. So my husband and I often joke, it was the most expensive MBA we've been through. So with that grew our passion for wanting to help businesses. We pivoted and looked at our experience. George, my husband and co-founder, came from a large manufacturing background in aerospace and defense. My background had been finance, and we said, what are our talents? He had been through mergers, he had been through sales, and we put all of that to work to bringing out Plethora Businesses 26 years later, top 20 in the nation. And it only happens because of the great team that we have and the hard work that we've put in it. So with that, I'd like to start this presentation with how we'll explore identifying, developing, and empowering leaders within your organization while strategically planning for a succession transition. We didn't have the benefit of that. And that's why I think this presentation is so important. So as Simon Sinek said, leadership is not about being in charge. It is about taking care of those in your charge. So let's get started. What are some of the most common mistakes that, Daniel, you see CEOs making when they delay that succession planning? And when should they start planning their exit?
Well, thank you, Dora. They say the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is today. Well, in my experience, 3 to 5 years is really the minimum time frame one needs to prepare an organization, ideally, for a succession, an exit, a transition. So from a time frame standpoint, if you haven't already started, you should today. Most organizations wait until the last minute. Suddenly they decide they want to sell, or they want to merge, or they want to acquire another organization, and they're simply not prepared. And since opportunities can knock at almost any unexpected time, through good times and bad times, in our experience, every organization should literally start today to plan succession. And we use the term succession more holistically than positionally. In other words, it is the succession of the firm, the entire organization, not just an individual.
Mm-hmm.
So the best practices that we have seen across the country, across industries, is when the leaders of an organization, whether it's a single individual or a team, say, we want to optimize, we want to future-proof our organization by really building a strong leadership team so that we can go through succession whenever the opportunity presents itself, which may be very soon or it may be down the road. So the tool that, or the mantra that we talk about is the 5 Ps. Proper planning prevents poor performance.
Yeah. And that's what's so apropos about the name of your company, Build It Backwards. How did you come up with that name? Because it's about what we should be doing as business owners.
Well, I would love to take credit for it, but I can't. My advisory board a few years ago kept suggesting that the old name of the firm, which was terrible and long and meant nothing, really didn't convey what we did. And they said, you literally work from the ideal future of an organization and reverse engineer, you build it backwards. Why don't you name the company that? And we argued for several months until they threatened to walk out. So we listened to our advisory board, and I will tell you, it was probably the best single marketing decision we ever made, thanks to the advisory board I'd put together, not my own genius.
Well, thank you for sharing that bit of information, Daniel. Jenny, many CEOs say they're too busy running their business to think about succession. What's your advice for balancing long-term planning with day-to-day operations?
Yeah, no, CEOs, founders, owners lead lives of significance, and they're so good at what they do with working in the business and dealing with the day-to-day, servicing their clients, managing their employees, and being a leader. What I would employ CEOs and founders to do is to also take the time to work on the business rather than just in the business. And the overall perspective is if you work on the business and take time to look at the strategic planning and growth of the company, all of those day-to-day activities can be so much more effective because then rather than taking a reactionary role, the CEO will take the role of being a steward of their legacy because they'll know based on where they want the growth, the trajectory, and the direction of the company to go. Hopefully, they'll end up ultimately saving time and becoming a bit more effective. There's definitely going to be a level of growing pains when a CEO steps out of working in the business and into on the business because there's going to be a stage of discovery. And those are really powerful lessons that a CEO will eventually learn to gain effectiveness. And really, that goes back to what Daniel impressed upon founders, which is if you start early today, then all of the information and knowledge can gain traction over time. And that's really the effectiveness of it all. We don't want to sugarcoat that this is indeed a difficult process. And inevitably, there's only 24 hours of the day. And so time taken away from being in the business and on the business is definitely a trade-off. But the whole point of this is if you start early, then all of that knowledge will actually build up over time and pay dividends.
Yeah. So well said. Thank you, Jenny. So a lack of planning leads to uncertainty, operational disruptions, and in worst cases, we've seen it, a decline in business simply because that CEO failed to step back to work on the business. And what makes some of these businesses really successful in an eventual exit, whether it's a sale, a merger, is identifying high potential leaders. Daniel, that's your specialty. Can you speak to that?
Well, thank you, Dora. When I wrote our book on the book on succession planning systems, one of the tools in there was we call critical roles. It's a way to sit back and within the organization, identify what are the most critical roles before we look at who might fill them. Not only for today, but for tomorrow, for the future. So it requires some strategic thinking. The best organizations I've seen around the country, around the world for that matter, actually develop a strategic plan, a long-term documented plan of where they want to take the organization. From there, you create what are the most important roles in the organization. Who's filling them now? Who might be able to step in over some period of time, etc. And from there, then to assess, okay, how many people do we have that show some leadership potential? So you could use a tool like performance versus potential to assess key people that you identify. And you compare that to another tool, which is a success profile. Your ideal candidate, Dora, for any position would demonstrate what experience, what education, what personal attributes, etc. And then you can measure an individual that you're looking at compared to your ideal, the gap or the difference is then what you want to put into a development plan. So it's a sequence of steps. Critical roles first, then assessing who might be potentials, then comparing that to a success profile. So you go from the macro to the micro, one step at a time, and then you can create individual development plans to bring these individuals over time into an ideal situation where they can step into the roles.
A kind of a roadmap for your business, if you will.
Exactly right. We call it a success roadmap.
A success roadmap. So what qualities are most critical for succession candidates?
Well, generally, you want someone who's going to demonstrate true leadership. And there's different ways to measure leadership. What we like to suggest is you measure strategic leadership. Can the individual innovate? Achievement leadership. Can they take initiative and get the job done? Team leadership. Can they build and manage a team? And then personal leadership. This is the emotional intelligence that you've talked about several times, and you might want to go a little deeper in that. But if you assess the individuals across these four different forms of leadership, you get a great baseline of what their potential is. But if I may turn it back to you, since I mentioned emotional intelligence, and you and I know this is so important, could you address that?
On emotional intelligence, I was just thinking about all those qualities that you just brought together in sharing with our audience so in such an articulate way. Realistically speaking, very few individuals will possess a good portion of all of those qualities, right? Sometimes what makes a good salesperson doesn't necessarily make them a great team player because they're very much about the win, right? And those in operations are not necessarily great salespeople or not having that big vision. So, are there tools out there that help you identify that emotional intelligence that's so required of leaders?
Actually, there are some emotional intelligence assessment tools, and we've used a couple of them to help identify real strengths within individuals and then gaps or opportunities for growth and development. Now, some people think that leaders are born. I don't believe that at all. I've seen too many excellent leaders who were not earlier in their careers good leaders, but were developed between a combination of their desire to be better and the training and development that they received. So yes, we use an EI assessment tool and then develop a plan from there.
Yeah,
So
and what I really love about this conversation, Daniel and Dora, is giving business owners and founders tools to meet their goals and their legacy, right? Tools in identifying them, tools in helping them understand what their growth areas are. And from a legal perspective, I like to talk about two particular tools that really help with alignment. And one of them is a level of incentive planning. And I think that business owners and founders are oftentimes very generous with their time and their growth, and they're oftentimes willing to share. And if they have the right incentive tools, once they've identified those key employees, creating alignment towards the direction of the company can be exceptionally powerful. Because a willingness to share profitability on a business that had scaled is a win-win for all parties involved. And then I think the other tool that I like to offer for business owners to consider is good governance. And I'd like to use an example to illustrate why that is really important in both a transition and a transaction environment. In a transition environment, a business owner was so kind and gifted shares of stock of their business over to their daughter, who unfortunately subsequently was in a divorce situation. And what happened was her ex-spouse demanded a forensic accounting of that enterprise which resulted in a very detailed audit. And so if we looked at this from a governance perspective, I would have encouraged the business owner to have certain buyout provisions in place so that that would never have occurred, like to begin with. Because an outside investigation inside the value of the business can be really disruptive. And I think another example is oftentimes businesses really need all of the founders to be active in the business. It's very rare where a business owner can also just be a passive investor. And so from a governance perspective, I would encourage them to set standards even amongst themselves to kind of manage their expectation going forward so resentment doesn't get built towards each other. So I think those are additional tools that we should encourage founders on incentive planning and governance.
So when you mentioned the word resentment there, Jenny, are you referring it to family dynamics in a business, or in which context?
Yeah, in all contexts. And I say that because business owners rely heavily on their employees who've worked with them from, quote, the beginning or have been with the business for over, quote, decades. And employees start feeling a level of resentment towards the founders because they feel like they've contributed so much but do not earn anything towards profitability. And then even amongst co-owners, as they personally go through life events, because we're all human beings. And so our personal lives, as we ebb and flow in that cycle of growth and struggle, also impacts the business. And so when we look at the largest transition of wealth in the next 2 to 3 decades, I think those dynamics will manifest in a more frequent level. So it's not intended to cause tension amongst folks, but really to kind of bring a transparent conversation so that sentiment doesn't occur.
Because nothing can destroy an organization more than that bad apple or that bad feeling that starts to spread like a cancer and can destroy companies. I mean, we've seen it in our practice where lack of putting good governance in place creates those situations. Daniel, what have you seen out there in working with individuals that just kind of speaks to this theme?
Well, core values are something that many organizations talk about, some even throw them out, but the culture of an organization makes a huge difference, not only on a day-to-day operation, but in how you can identify and develop future leaders. And it goes to even the valuation, as you have seen in a sale. Does the organization have true core values that they live, or do they have words on the wall that everybody ignores? And I'll use a quick example. I'm working with third generation company right now. We worked with them 10 years ago. We went through and helped them develop their vision, mission, and core values, which they took very seriously, and they literally printed on the wall in the conference room and in the lunchroom. So everyone sees them every day. And they have conversations periodically if they see examples of someone who's veering away from that. So they've developed and this is a good sized company. They've got 120 employees. They have a family feel, and yet they continually stress core values. They make decisions based on their core values. And they said when an executive or a decision maker isn't around and someone who's not in a leadership role has to make a decision, we've told them, if you make a decision consistent with our core values, it's probably the right decision and we'll back you. And I think that having those core values that an organization lives leads to developing a very strong culture, which really supports everything that Jenny is talking about in building an optimal organization.
And an optimal organization, when buyers are looking to make acquisitions, they're looking at the leadership team. They want to know that that business is going to continue to operate profitably after that CEO founder exits. They want to know that if that CEO was the core value of relationships with customers, that someone else can step in and has been doing it. When we're working with our clients, we ask a very important question. When you go on vacation, how many times do you check in? And if you answer every day, wrong, you know, you're not building the organization to run without you. And I think build it backwards. What Jenny's stressing is you've got to step out of your business and think about the organization running without you so that you maximize value and so that you create that transition, whether it's passing it on to your family members, passing it on to your employees, or doing an exit or sale or merger.
Yeah, Dora, that's a really great point. One common question that I get from business owners who are looking for a transaction rather than a transition is how do I increase my quote multiple or my EBITDA or my enterprise value? Being the seasoned investment banker in the room, can you speak to that?
Oh, most certainly. And I think we're big on advising our clients to build a strong management team. A strong management team in place will probably increase a one-time multiple of EBITDA, if not more. The other things that add value to a business is diversification, whether it is product diversification, customer diversification, geographic diversification. It's the opposite of putting all of your eggs in one basket, right? So if something goes wrong, you have nothing left. But if you're diversified, this product may not work well, but we have 10 other lines that are working well. So think about your business surviving disruptions at every point. Can it still survive? Can it still grow? And that's the importance of developing that management team as well, is you need to be able to step away because is it scalable? Is your business scalable? Can a financial buyer looking to establish a platform in a given industry come in and run that business without them being physically there every single day? That's a lot of the buyer pool that's in the marketplace. The other buyer pool is the strategic acquirer, right? So it's strategic acquirer, rather than going out to hire new teams, would much rather pay a fair price for an ongoing concern that's proven success, right? So the value of investing in your people, the value of investing in that succession planning cannot be overemphasized in this presentation. So at some point, every business owner will face that fundamental question. Do I pass the torch internally? Or do I explore external options? For some, a sale, for some, a merger. And it's not just a financial decision, it's also about ensuring that their business survives them, the legacy, taking care of their employees, taking care of the people that help them achieve that success. So a lot to think about. So Jenny, starting with basics, what are the biggest advantages and challenges of selling outright versus merging with another company from a legal perspective?
Yeah, if I could start and talk about the life cycle of a business in answering that question, all businesses start out in a learning environment in phase one, where essentially they need knowledge capital and financial capital. And essentially, as they scale into phase two, where they're acquiring that, in phase three, mastering, I think there's a difference between selling the assets of the business one by one or selling the whole enterprise and getting the value of a going concern. A lot of business owners usually strive to continue their legacy in taking care of their employees, taking care of the customer relationships, and taking care of their community. And there's oftentimes a struggle between preservation of existing relationships and trying to grow the business and making sure that it survives. And so what I found the journey for a business owner succession plan is that it's not necessarily like a straight line. It's more of like a roller coaster, like along the way with ups and downs. And what we hope is that they'll catch this opportunity on their way up, right? And so what I've discovered with a lot of businesses is they definitely take the time and effort to invest in their employees, to find successors, and life happens. And as a result, while they're preparing for these type of tools that we just talked about, especially with what Daniel talked about with identifying them, they'll get to a point where they realize as the economy continues to also go through this roller coaster, there's an opportunity for them to catch the trend of the business as it's really going to its peak years after 3 years of growth. And at that time, usually they'll think now is the right time because they're able to maximize on value to a certain extent. And more importantly, probably take that longer vacation that you talked about. And so these are not hard and steadfast rules. These are examples that I'm providing our attendees today because they have to sit down and think how much is enough for them to retire? When is the right time for them to sell? And for them to kind of look backwards at all of the activities that they've done to date and really decide, do they want to embark in the succession endeavor, or are they really ready for this transaction like methodology and sale, like instead? And what I found is business owners really start to embrace it all and eventually go through a sale process. With respect to a merger or a financial buyer, oftentimes the question is for a business owner who can take care of their employees the most. And that is when through, let's just call it the courtship or the letter of intent negotiation process, that a business owner will be confronted with those type of decisions. And so it'll depend on, whether they've talked to Daniel about their vision, mission, and values in making a decision on which path or the other.
Thank you, Jenny. A lot to think about out there for our business owners present today. Now, Daniel, what are the biggest succession planning mistakes you've seen in your practice, and how can they be avoided?
Well, generally, the biggest single mistake I see, Dora, is not doing succession planning at all. It's waiting until a crisis happens and making a decision, which we all know is about the worst thing you can do. So if business owners recognize that they don't want to die under their desk, but you and I have seen a few that have said that's what they want to do. But for everyone else, it's a matter of where do I want to take the organization? And is it, going back to an earlier point that I think Jenny made, are we trying to leave a legacy? Are we trying to take care of our employees? Am I trying to maximize the value that I'm going to get? I mean, what's your motivation? So one of the places we start with organizations is what is the purpose of doing your succession plan? Is it to plan for growth, merger, sale? What is the real purpose? And what do you want your legacy to be? Now, most people don't necessarily think about that in those terms until you challenge them. What do you want your legacy to be? That starts a conversation about what they want to leave, how they want to be remembered. And that really goes back to what do we want to do with this organization? If you're trying to maximize the value, sell it, move on to your next opportunity, okay. And you need to start that today. If you want to grow this for the next 20 years and then sell it internally or to family or, it's thinking about the options. So the biggest mistakes we see people making is not starting early enough, not thinking about what they want in the future, and not really thinking about anything other than today, today, today. So thinking a little more strategically is so terribly important.
And it brings to mind a transaction we worked on with logistics in the logistics space. Young, three partners, husband, wife, brothers, sisters, right? Um, in their early 30s, and they get the normal phone call from us because we had been approached by a very strategic acquirer looking to make acquisitions in logistics. And when we first talked to them, they weren't ready. They were still in their young, early 30s. But we stayed in touch. Uh, Fast forward 3, 4 years later, they had grown their revenues to where now they had significant value, but they were still young. So what was their motivation in a sale? One of the brothers and wife just wanted to retire it off in the sunset and not have to worry about working the rest of their lives. Another one wanted to still build was ingrained in him. So they did a sale. The younger brother reinvested in a $50 million sale. He invested 10% of his profits into a new company, and that later sold for $139 million. Not bad, right? So what are the motivations and being ready when that opportunity arises?
Right.
So how can founders ensure their vision and culture endures after their departure? From your work, Daniel.
Well, establishing a true vision is where you start, which is really strategic planning before you do succession planning. And a vision, as we work with clients on, is how you want to save the world. What difference do you want to make? A vision does not change over decades or even generations of an organization. So establishing a vision first, then the mission, which is what we do for whom to fulfill that vision, and then establishing those few core values. You can walk into Sprouts and they have 24 core values on the wall. I think it's wonderful that they think that they can live up to 24 core values. I find that a little impractical. Generally, 4 to 6 true core values, the bedrock of an organization, is what people can relate to and build from. And those 3 tools, I think, are always the foundation. And that's where I would start.
Jenny, anything to add to that?
No, Daniel, I wholeheartedly share your perspective, and I'm going to give a really ugly story of what happens when you don't do foundational planning. And so this business owner was exceptionally kind. He adopted a daughter from South America who was in her teens. And when she was in college, he passed away and he left his mother as a trustee to take care of her. Unfortunately, he did not update his corporation to be vested in the trust. So that's one issue. Then in addition to that, he ran such a successful business that his operating entity bought real estate. And so he was actually paying himself rent for passive investment. Since his business did not get vested in the trust, it was unclear who the president, treasurer, and secretary and director were supposed to be. The bank ended access and will not give his mom, the trustee of the trust, access to the bank account. And as a result, that underlying tenant, the operating business, couldn't pay rent to the building landlord owner, which was a trust. And then the building landlord owner couldn't pay real property taxes was owed. So this led to a cascade between really deterioration of the business, impacting the lives of who he genuinely cared about, and leading into other consequences as well. And so when Daniel said that really it starts with a level of foundational planning outside of the business, this is one of those issues where something as simple as having a living trust and making sure that things are invested appropriately would really make a core difference. Part of it is, I think there's a level of calm that a founder and a business owner would have once that's done. And there's a level of clarity in mind that would allow them to really focus on the vision mission of the business, because there's a level of calmness within themselves. And then that would naturally percolate to the business and the growth of it. Yeah.
And Jenny, since you gave an example of the ugly, I'll step back and give an example of the bad, and then Dora can give us an example of the good. Um, and this ties into one of your earlier questions, Dora, about planning. We were introduced to a client, 3 co-owners, co-founders, who decided they wanted to sell the business. They were going to go through a succession. So I met with them to find out where they were, what they needed, and they said, we want this particular price. And I looked at their financials and I said, that's 72 times earnings, 72 times EBITDA. And they said, yes. I said, but your revenues have been flat for 10 years. And the industry norm is 7 times earnings. You want 10 times the industry norm. And when do you want this? Because I'm thinking, well, maybe they're going to build up over 10 years. Oh no, we want to close in 12 months. So you have flat revenues, you want 10 times the industry norm, and you want to close yesterday. I suggested that maybe they wanted to work with someone else because this was just unrealistic. We could find a way to help them build. We could find a way maybe to get them more value. But the combination of factors meant this was not going to sell. So this was the one time, perhaps I should have been more diplomatic, I got thrown out of a prospective client. Now, the reason I call this a bad example, not because of me, but because they ended up filing bankruptcy 2 years later because they wouldn't take advice, they wouldn't engage professionals to help them do any of the things they needed to do. And it was completely avoidable. So, Dora, could you give us a good example?
Bring us home, Dora.
Follow that. I think the common theme here and what we really want the audience to take away is set realistic expectations. And those realistic expectations may start with knowing what the market is. That's one. And if those expectations of knowing what the market is do not align with what you need, because sometimes is what a business owner needs versus what their business is worth, right? They need to go back to doing homework. They need to meet with Jenny. They need to meet with their financial planner. They need to understand what that number in retirement looks like. And if that business is not the vehicle to get them there where it is today, they need to work with someone like Daniel to help grow that business, to help identify those elements of a business that create success. You asked me for a good example. The good example was that Trump transportation, and believe it or not, that was the name of their business. It's called Trump. Trump Transportation, no relationship to President Trump, but it was a Trump card. Even their marketing technique was interesting. The four aces. I don't know if you've driven through Southern California, you've seen 4 aces on these trucks called the Trump card. And it's how to position your business where you're in a niche market, where you have great management teams, where you have good profit margins. And it starts with empowering your people. It starts with early planning. It starts with meeting with Jenny, make sure your governance documents are in place. It starts with working with a consultant, because there is value for working with someone outside your organization to help you see the business from a strategic standpoint, not just being in the business. When we're in the business, we're putting out fires. We're wearing multiple hats. But really taking that step back to help develop that roadmap that CEOs need to have in place. So I love it. Build it backwards. Think about that. we're coming at 10:45. We want to see if we have any questions from our audience. Galilea, do we have anything that's come up?
Yes, we have a question from someone in the audience. They asked, I know I need a succession plan, but I feel like my company isn't quite ready yet. What's the first step I should take to start the process without disrupting my day-to-day operations?
Daniel, that's right up your alley.
Yes. Have a conversation with a professional because as we said, if your firm isn't ready yet, that's the time to begin your planning. You want 3 to 5 years as a minimum to be able to assess your organization and what you want to do and who you have that can grow within the organization and grow the organization and determine what you want in the future, as well as going to Dora's point, making sure that what you're going to be able to get from a succession is going to meet all your future needs. We recently met with a client, and one of the first things I had them do was meet with their own individual fee-based financial planner to determine post-transaction, post-tax, what they would end up with and how that would match with their lifelong dreams. In other words, could they maintain their lifestyle? So there is no time that is too early to start, but the value that is created, the ability to future-proof your organization, comes directly from early planning, which gives you the ability to make decisions without the pressure of, oh my goodness, we're approaching a transaction.
Right. I 100% agree with Daniel. If you think about misalignment, a 1 degree difference doesn't make a big difference today. But if you go and continue in that direction over a 10-year period of time, for example, then you can be very off base with your original intention, right?
Yeah.
And so when we talk about the 5-year or 3-year, there's an underlying technical reason from my perspective, which is if you are not the right tax entity, for example, there are mitigation strategies that does not disrupt operations that can be taken at the 5-year before a transition or a transaction mark. And then in addition to that, the statute of limitations for most claims is around 4 years. And so if there is something that at the operational perspective that a business owner is worried about, then there's actually an opportunity to correct it while the business is still under their watch. So that in the event of a transition to the next generation, they don't have to worry about that liability spilling over, or in a transaction where a buyer is taking control over the business, you're able to mitigate any liability back to yourself. So these are real concrete dates of why practitioners like ourselves use like this date as an anchoring point.
And to your point, Jenny, and this is so important for our audience, is if you're thinking of a succession planning, if you're thinking of an eventual sale or a merger, work with an M&A attorney. Work with someone that has experience in managing those kinds of transactions. We see it in our practice. Nothing derails a transaction more than an attorney in place that has never managed an M&A transaction in their practice. So you may get along really well with your corporate attorney or whether your family law attorney or your friend Pete, but if they don't have the experience in M&A, do yourselves a favor. Please connect with someone like Jenny. I cannot tell you from 26 years and doing over 2,000 transactions as a team, the difference between having good counsel on your side versus inexperienced counsel, it's night and day, and the outcomes are night and day. Also in that operational planning, things that increase value, getting together with your CPA, getting your books and records in order early on. If you don't have reviewed financials, consider getting them reviewed. If you want to make the investment in audited financials, I can tell you from experience is that those buyers coming to the table looking at merging with your company or buying your company will pay more for your business if you have audited financials. So the biggest takeaway here is that it takes time to plan. It takes a team on your corner to do it successfully well. And, hire people that are going to make that journey and make them part of your advisory board so that you can meet your objectives. And along with that, emotionally start preparing for what life looks like after a sale or after a merger, because that's part of the component of that planning. Anything else to add, Daniel? I think we've covered a lot.
We covered a lot. I just would be curious if there's any other questions from the audience specifically that we could answer. Because Jenny and I probably could go on for the next 2 to 3 hours talking on this subject.
Oh, yeah. Galilea, any more questions?
Yes, I do have one more. Someone asked, I have a strong leadership team, but I'm not sure if anyone internally is truly ready to take over my company. How do I determine whether to develop an internal successor or look for an external hire?
That's a loaded question, Daniel, right up your alley.
Well, in this particular situation, part of this is going to be your gut. And part of it, I would suggest, look at your own role. Take the success profile that we talked about earlier. Experience, education, personal attributes, accomplishments, and look at you and fill out the success profile. And then compare that to the individual, very as objectively as you can. How far away from what is critically important to step into your role is this individual? And do you have the time and the willingness to train and develop them into your shoes over some period of time? I've seen in many cases the ability to do that if we allow ourselves enough time. If this person is strong in certain areas and you don't think they can ever be developed in other areas, then you might want to look outside and see, is there someone who is more aligned with your core values, your success profile, your vision of the organization?
Thank you, Daniel. Well, we're coming up. We have one more Q&A. Galilea. Nope.
It was actually just a thank you. We got a thank you from somebody in the audience, so thank you so much for that. But as for the chat, I think all the questions have been answered so far.
Have been answered. Well, so as you leave today, first, thank you to our audience for taking the time to join us. And I challenge you to take one step towards securing your company's future, whether that's mentoring a key employee, formalizing a succession plan, or consulting an advisor. A lot of information was shared. Take one step forward to that long-term plan. Thank you to our incredible panelists, Jenny, Daniel. It's always such a pleasure to work with the two of you. You're so full of knowledge and practical advice. And I think most importantly, being able to present it in a way that is easy to understand. Thank you again to Galilea for coordinating the webinar, and to you, our audience, for attending. Have a great day.
Have a great day.